3 weeks after Samhain, the world looked exactly the same as it had before. That was the part no one had warned me about. I am not sure what I had expected. Something visible, something that announced itself. The veil restored, the binding complete, 2 marked ones having done what the Morrigan had arranged them to do. Surely that would leave some mark on the world that ordinary people could see and maim and understand. It didn't. The market at the village 3 miles east of Dunmara still sold flour and tallow and overpriced salt. The roads were still bad after the autumn rains. The days were getting shorter in the specific, relentless way of Irish November that suggests that sunlight is a rumor from a more optimistic country. And the Aondacht was still the Aondacht. That was the part I had most needed to be wrong about. 3 weeks after the binding was made, and the veil was sealed, and 7 ancient persons had gone home through a door that no one had opened in 3 centuries. 3 weeks after all of that, a woman named Breed was burned in the village of Kilmore, 40 miles north of where we were walking. Not by the Aondacht directly. That was new. That was how it had changed. The Aondacht had spent 300 years teaching ordinary people to do the burning themselves, to see what they feared in their neighbors, to name it contamination, to solve it with fire without needing soldiers to arrive first. 300 years of very successful teaching. The veil was restored. The lesson was not. Quietly, I heard about Breed from a traveling merchant who stopped at the same inn as us 2 days out of Dunmara. He told the story the way people tell stories about things that happened to other people, with the comfortable distance of someone for whom it was information rather than experience. I listened to every word. Across the table from me, Tom listened too. I did not look at him while the merchant spoke. I did not need to. I could feel the quality of his stillness change, the way it changed whenever something arrived that he was adding to an internal account he intended to settle. When the merchant finished and moved on to other news, the price of wool, the condition of the northern road, Tom said nothing. He put his hand flat on the table between us. I put mine over it. Quietly, we changed direction the next morning, north, towards Kilmore, towards whatever was left of the First Coven on our list, that was now also the site of a burning that had happened 3 weeks after the binding was supposed to have changed things. This was going to be more complicated than we had thought. It was going to take longer than we had thought. I had already understood both of these things. Understanding them had not made the merchant's story easier to hear. It had only made it clearer that we were exactly where we were supposed to be, doing exactly what needed to be done, which was the most and least comforting thing I knew how to think. We had been traveling together for 3 weeks. I want to say something about what that meant. About what it was like to be in constant proximity to another person after 23 years of learning to need as little proximity as possible. It was not what I had expected. I had expected it to be like the first 3 days. Survival mode, calculation, the specific focused intensity of 2 people moving toward an urgent destination with no time or energy for anything that was not immediately relevant. It wasn't like that. 3 weeks of ordinary road, cold mornings, and questionable inns, and the rhythm of 2 people learning what it meant to share a daily life rather than a crisis. Some things I had expected. I had expected him to be competent. He was, entirely, quietly, in every practical respect, without requiring acknowledgement or producing drama about it. The fire was always made, the watch was always kept, the decisions about which road and which inn and which route were made with the swift,
accurate judgment of someone who had been assessing terrain and risk his entire adult life. I had not expected him to be funny. Not often, not loudly, but occasionally, in the dry, precise way of someone who notices the absurdity of things and makes one observation about it rather than several, and somehow that single observation was always the right one. I had not expected to find myself looking for it, the single dry observation, listening for it the way you listen for a specific instrument in a piece of music you have begun to know well. 3 weeks out of Dún Mara, on a cold November morning, on a road that had not been properly maintained since before either of us was born, I slipped on a patch of mud and would have gone down entirely if he had not caught my arm. He steadied me, said nothing for a moment, then he said with perfect seriousness that it was fortunate we had restored the veil before attempting the northern road in November, or the structural integrity of the entire enterprise would have been in question. I laughed. I had not laughed genuinely, without calculation, since before I was 9 years old. It was a strange sensation, not unpleasant. He was still holding my arm when I laughed, and I felt his hand tighten fractionally, not in alarm, in something else, something that I chose not to examine too closely on a mud road in the cold November rain. He let go after a moment. I was aware of the specific temperature change when he did. We kept walking. I was aware of that, too.
Kilmore was a village the size of Dún Mara that felt smaller. Not in the physical sense. The houses were the same stone and thatch, the market square the same cold cobblestones, the well the same position at the center that all wells occupied in all villages built by people who understood what mattered. Smaller in the way that places are smaller after something has been taken out of the middle of them. We arrived in the afternoon of the 3rd day from Dún Mara. The village was not empty. People moved through the square, smoke came from chimneys, a blacksmith worked at his forge with the specific rhythmic patience of someone who has decided that the best response to everything is to keep working. The specific quality of how people moved, quickly, without lingering, without the small interactions that fill village squares in ordinary times, told me everything about what 3 weeks of aftermath looked like on the ground. Tom saw it too. I knew he saw it because his pace changed, not slowing, adjusting, the specific adjustment of someone shifting from one mode of attention to another. We found an inn and took a room, one room which had become the practical arrangement over 3 weeks of inns that were variably trustworthy, and the simple fact that 2 people with marks on their wrists that occasionally glowed were more visible than either of us wanted to be if separated. The sleeping arrangement was practical. He took the floor the first night without discussion. I told him the floor was unnecessary, and he said it wasn't, and I said it was, and he said that sleeping on the floor was something a man did when he had spent 10 years making decisions he was still in the process of answering for, and that he found it clarifying. I had not had an adequate response to that. By the 2nd week, he was no longer on the floor, but on the opposite side of whatever bed the inn provided, with the specific precision of someone who has made a decision about a boundary and intends to respect it with complete consistency. The boundary was respected. I was aware of it. The boundary, the consistency, the specific warmth of another person sleeping within arm's reach in a cold November room after 23 years of sleeping alone. I did not say anything about it. Neither did he. Some things were allowed to be true before they were named. I had learned that from him, as it happened.
We found her on the 2nd morning. Not because she came to us. She was far too careful for that. and she had every reason to be careful, and I respected that completely. We found her because I felt the mark respond while we were walking through the market square, a specific frequency, not the frequency of stone or threshold or veil, something different, smaller, human, the specific frequency of someone who carried something old in their blood and had been carrying it quietly for so long that it had become background noise even to them. She was selling dried herbs from a basket. She was perhaps 60 years old, with the hands of someone who had worked with plants her entire life, and the eyes of someone who had learned, at some point, to make her eyes as ordinary as possible. I recognized that look. I had worn it for 14 years. I did not approach her directly. I bought herbs I didn't need, dried meadowsweet, a bundle of late-season yarrow, and when I pressed the coins into her hand, I let my marked wrist turn upward, briefly, without announcement. Her eyes went to it. Her hands did not shake. She was better trained than shaking. But she looked at the mark the way someone looks at a word in a language they were told they had forgotten and have just discovered they still know. I held her gaze. She gave me the herbs and a very small nod, and a time and a location, communicated in the specific, compressed code of people who have been having clandestine conversations in plain sight for generations, and I walked away. Behind me, I heard Tom buy a completely unnecessary quantity of dried rosemary, with the pleasant manner of a man who buys large amounts of dried rosemary regularly and finds nothing unusual about it. I did not smile until we were out of the square. Then I smiled. He saw it. I knew he saw it because of the quality of the silence he produced in response, the specific silence of someone who has received something they are going to carry carefully. We had 2 hours until the meeting. We spent them in the inn, planning, sitting across a small table from each other with a map between us, and our heads close over it, closer than the map required, both of us aware of that, neither of us adjusting. His voice was low when we talked through the approach, not because of the inn walls and who might hear, though that too, but in the way his voice had been getting lower over the 3 weeks of proximity, settling into something I felt rather than heard. I had stopped pretending that I did not notice. I had not yet decided what to do about noticing.
Her name was Sorcha, the same name as my mother. I held that for a moment when she told us, sat with the specific weight of a coincidence that the Morrigan probably considered entirely deliberate. And then I let it settle into the place where I kept the things that were true and significant, and that I would return to when I had time to return to things properly. She met us in the back room of a house at the edge of the village, the house of her daughter, she told us, who was not of the craft, but who knew what her mother was, and had spent 3 weeks in the specific terror of someone waiting for the knock on the door that would mean they had come for the rest of the family. Sorcha herself was not afraid. Or, more accurately, she had been afraid for so long that fear had become simply the medium she moved through, like water for a fish, unremarkable, constant, no longer requiring acknowledgement. I recognized that too. I told her who we were, what had happened at Samhain, the binding, the veil, the stones. I showed her the mark. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at Tom, at his scar, his bearing, the black armor he still wore because we had not yet found a practical alternative, with the expression of someone adding a complicated sum in their head. She asked him in the flat voice of someone who has earned the right to ask directly if he was Aondacht. He said, without deflection, without the softening that would have been easier, that he had been, that he was not anymore, that he had spent 10 years doing damage he was now in the process of answering for. She looked at him for a very long time. Then she said something else, something that made the room change in the specific way rooms change when information arrives that reconfigures everything you thought you were walking into. She said that Breed, the woman who had been burned 3 weeks ago, had not been killed because someone in Kilmore recognized what she was. She had been killed because someone had told them. Someone who knew exactly who in the Coven still carried the old knowledge. Someone who had, before all of this began, spent 12 years acquiring every piece of that knowledge. I looked at Tom. He was already looking at me. "Davin," I said. He said nothing. He didn't need to.
We stayed in Silmore for 3 days. We helped Sorka do what could be done, which was less than I had hoped and more than nothing, which was the honest accounting of most of what could be done for things that had been broken over a long time. We sent word south to 2 of the people who had left. We walked the village with Sorka, and she showed us the places where the old knowledge had lived. A hollow in an oak at the edge of the settlement, where offerings had been left for 3 generations. A spring at the field's edge that had not yet forgotten its name. A pattern in the way the houses had been built that followed an older pattern entirely, the kind that could not be deliberately constructed, but could be recognized by someone who knew what to look for. I knew what to look for. On the last evening after Sorka had gone home and the village had settled into the specific quiet of a place that goes to sleep early in November, because there is no good reason not to, Tom and I sat by the fire in the inn's common room, and for the first time in 3 weeks, we had nothing that needed to be done before we could simply be still. We were both aware of it. The fire was good. Someone had laid it properly, real oak, the kind that burned steady and honest and warm without drama. The room had emptied around us gradually, the other travelers finding their beds, until it was only us and the fire, and the particular quality of a room at night when the work is done. He had been quiet all evening, not the tense silence of someone processing something difficult, the settled quiet of someone who is simply present in where they are. I had been watching him in the firelight. I had been watching him in firelight for 3 weeks, and I had not said anything about the watching because I was still in the process of deciding what to say about it. Some things took longer to name than others. He turned and looked at me. I did not look away. For a long moment, we simply looked at each other in the firelight, the way we had looked at each other across interrogation tables and forest clearings and threshold doorways and cold moorland dawns, except that all of those times there had been something else present: urgency, danger, the specific pressure of things that needed to happen, and this time there was nothing, except the fire and the quiet and us, and it turned out that without the urgency, the looking was considerably more significant. He reached across the space between us, not far. We had stopped maintaining far distances 3 weeks ago, and tucked a piece of my hair behind my ear. The most ordinary gesture in the world. My heart did something I had no adequate word for. He left his hand at the side of my face for a moment, warm, still, entirely certain, the way he was with everything that mattered to him, his gray-blue eyes on mine. Then he said, very quietly, in the voice that had gotten lower and warmer over 3 weeks, and that I felt somewhere below ordinary hearing, he said he had been thinking about what Sorka had said, about the 4 people buried, the 3 who left, what was left of something that lasted 4 generations. He said he understood, for the first time completely, what the last 10 years had been in actual human terms, not in the abstract, not as a strategic error, but in what it cost specific people in specific places who had done nothing wrong. He said he was going to spend the rest of his life answering for it. And then, still in the same voice, without changing anything, as though the two things were the same sentence, he said he was glad he would not be doing it alone. I looked at him in the firelight, at this man who knocked on the door I had been waiting behind for 7 years of his dreams, who held a line against 4 ancient forces for 55 minutes, who bought unnecessary rosemary in market squares and made one dry observation about November roads that made me laugh for the first time since I was 8 years old, who slept on inn floors as an act of penance and tucked my hair back in firelight as an act of something else entirely. I put my hand over his, the scarred palm, the scar like burned branches, the scar that matched my mark and matched it since before either of us knew what matching meant. "I know," I said. He turned his hand under mine and held it. We sat by the fire for a long time. In the morning, a rider arrived from the south with a letter sealed in Davin's precise handwriting. I opened it. Inside, 2 lines. No greeting, no signature. Davin did not waste words on the architecture of letters. The 2 lines said this: "The texts were incomplete. There is a second binding that predates the first, and that the Morrigan did not mention, and I have just found evidence that it has already been broken." I read the letter twice. I passed it to Tom. He read it once, he only ever needed once, and looked up at me with the gray-blue eyes that had looked away first in the interrogation room and had not looked away from me since. We neither spoke for a moment. Then, "How far south is Davin?" I asked. 3 days, Tom said. I folded the letter carefully and put it in my cloak and stood up from the inn's table and faced south. We had work to do. End of Episode 1, Season 2. Next, what the second binding was, who broke it, and why the Morrigan, who arranged everything else with such elaborate precision, chose not to mention that it existed.